Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads. Today, we've got a news stream and Ask Us Anything for you all. So make sure you're sending in your questions. We already have a bunch in the chat. So send in those questions, those comments, anything you'd like to discuss for the next hour to hour and a half based on the flow of the conversation. But we have a lot of things to discuss today, and not too many things in the world of news, but one sad thing for most of us who obviously love this franchise that our YouTube channel is based on, and then just film in general. An icon has passed away. James Earl Jones passes away at the age of 93 yesterday. A legendary actor, absolutely incredible career, and some of the most iconic voices in film history between Mufasa and Darth Vader. But just so many great live action roles as well. I mean, Field of Dreams was one of the first times I ever saw him in anything that wasn't related to Star Wars. And then even recently, I watched like maybe 2 months ago at this point, Conan the Barbarian. He's awesome in Conan the Barbarian. He's the main villain. So just so many iconic, great roles. So we want to pay tribute to James Earl Jones in this week's episode. So keep sending in your questions, your comments, everything. We will get to them as soon as we get a little further down talking about Mr. Jones's passing. We also have a couple other stories that are kind of small, but maybe some, especially this one about a Disney lawsuit over the use of Tarkin, that kind of could have consequences possibly for other things we see here in the future. So we'll talk about some of that stuff as well as our continued thoughts on Outlaws. Every time I say Outlaws, I want to say Acolyte for some reason. I guess it's just those one-word titles with "the" in the front. And it always seems the same word to me. But anyway, we're going to talk about Outlaws a little bit. This isn't our full review. We're still going to have a full review possibly next week during the stream. Then we'll parse it out for all of you who want to hear our full thoughts. But we're still making our way through that game. So we'll give you guys our thoughts there. But yes, of course, as always, ask us anything you would want in the chat. I see we have some chats about some non-Star Wars things. That is always great too. These weeks, we especially don't have much news to talk about. We always would love to hear more stuff from you guys about your other interests or other things you'd like to discuss outside of Star Wars. So you're welcome to send in anything you want into the chat, and we will get to it as soon as possible. As always, it's first come, first serve. So if you would like to make sure you get a chat on our streams, we can usually be long-winded, and there are a lot of people who send in chats. So you can send in a super chat, helps out the channel, and then you get your chats bumped up to the top of the stream. So we will answer them for sure in case you were running low on time here around the hour and a half mark, which is where we will cap out this week's stream. Make sure you like the video as well. We have more people watching right now than have liked the video. It's extremely important for us and for our channel as we continue to branch out to more Star Wars fans, get out there, have more people join these chats and these streams to get to talk about Star Wars every single week. Make sure you like the video. It helps us out a lot. If you're watching on replay, make sure you're commenting your thoughts and join us every single week. We go live every single Tuesday to discuss all the latest in the world of Star Wars and just give you guys a chance to get to know us and talk to us a bit more. All right, so without further ado, like I alluded to, James Earl Jones passed away yesterday at the age of 93. He is an incredible actor, some of the best voice acting in history of film, and that is what he'll probably be most remembered for when it comes to film, is obviously Darth Vader. Creating the voice of Darth Vader is there's very few voices in the entirety of entertainment that are more iconic than that, but also using that similar voice to play Mufasa a few years later, 20 years later. And then so many great iconic live action performances. Sanak, I'm going to pass it over to you for some of your thoughts on the passing of James Earl Jones and some of the things that you remember him best for.
Yeah, I mean, I think you pointed out that, like, yes, we'll remember him as the voice, which, people don't always know this, but he was uncredited for Darth Vader in the first film, right? And he is half of the entire characterization. Like, if we went with just, the original voice, it wouldn't have been as iconic. Let's just put it that way. But, it took many parts to make Darth Vader who he was. And it's a shame that even though people will obviously with great reason love that voice of his, it's not just that, right? It's the fact that he has an EGOT. He is someone who's won an Emmy, a Grammy, an Oscar, and Tony. Yes, it's technically non-competitive, but there's only like 30 people in history who've ever managed to do all four, which is incredible, right? Like it is something that nobody really does. And unless they're like such intelligent and such charismatic figures and titans of their industry and of their craft. And he was, right? Like Denzel Washington, who for so many of us is probably like the modern day great in Hollywood at this point. He's like, yeah, I just wanted to be as good as his voice, right? Which is that says so much already. Like I just wanted to be like him. And so much of what we don't know about his career in the public masses is because he was such a gifted theater actor, right? So he's been acting since the late 50s in theater on Broadway. He's, I think, only the second African American to ever have a Broadway theater named after them. It was the Court Theater that was renamed for him in 2022. Like, that's such an incredible honor. And you don't get that just because, like, you've won a couple awards and you made some big movies. Like, no, you have to be someone that the people who are so dedicated to the craft, regardless of how it's executed, love you, right? Like, and by all means, he's wonderful. And like I think it was maybe like 15 minutes before the news officially came out, but I saw that clip from Big Bang Theory randomly pop up on like Instagram, and it was just like Sheldon like running into him at the theater, and he sorry, not a theater, but a restaurant. He's like, "Oh, you're here because you want like Star Wars. That's all, and I've done all these other roles, but you don't care." And then he just like pulls down this big smile. He's like, "Guess what? I love Star Wars too." And right, and like the charm of the man, like even in like a role that he's just playing himself, like just so wonderful. And in that same episode, like they go crash Carrie Fisher's house, right? And that was apparently the first time they'd ever met because he was always a voice in a sound booth, and obviously she's on set, right? And that was wonderful, right? Like it's yeah, she was like, "Oh, I'm finally meeting you, Dad." And now to know that like both of them are gone, right? Like it's a tragedy, but at least like we can say that he had an incredible long-lived life that was so fulfilling, and yet it still feels like there was just so much more to go, right? Like that's the incredible thing about being a Star Wars fan for these people who've been around since day one. Became legends in so many people's eyes because of Star Wars, but when you actually get to see what their whole career is like, they're like, "Wow, like, Star Wars is just a part of how incredible they were. It just happens to be the thing that made them so well publicly known." But if you actually see all the things that they've done in their career, yeah, fantastic. Like, so that's the thing that I always, like, hear about people who are like, "Yeah, there's some people who will come to Star Wars, and that'll just be their defining thing." But that's not such a bad thing, right? Like people always compare a Hamill and a Fisher to Harrison Ford's obviously incredible career, but Hamill is known now for his incredible voice acting. I mean, he is the definitive Joker for so many of us. Carrie Fisher it was considered like maybe the most gifted script doctor, the person who's going to tweak up the dialogue, improve the flow of things. Her biography about her life with, bipolar and everything turns out to be an incredible role, an incredible film. Like, yeah, like these people were incredible people first and foremost. And, we're going to miss James Earl Jones because of all he accomplished as an actor, but we're going to miss the person too, because he was by all accounts, just an incredible and warm soul.
Yeah, absolutely. And he gave a lot to this role, like you were saying. He constantly came back, so many cameos, so many times. I mean, even in the last few years, right? In his late 80s, early 90s, coming and voicing this character. And it wouldn't be the same without him in things like Rogue One or Rebels. Just absolutely an essential piece of Star Wars. And one of the things that makes it work. I mean, we've talked about it so many times before about how he was that last missing piece. They still weren't sure what they were gonna do with the voice of Darth Vader until after they had finished the movie for the most part, and they still had David Prowse's voice, who, gets underserved as well with when people talk about Darth Vader, but yeah, just so many people involved with creating that character and the four big names. I mean, between James Earl Jones, David Prowse, Sebastian Shaw, and Hayden Christensen, that character has been served so well, and James Earl Jones has been one of the best ambassadors for that character, and just so many great memories about around his voice and around Darth Vader. It's just he's irreplaceable. So it is leaving a big hole in the world of Star Wars. And one of the ones too that I can't believe I forgot when I mentioned Conan and Field of Dreams earlier, the Sandlot. He has a great scene
Yeah.
in the Sandlot.
Yeah.
That was probably actually the first time I saw him outside of Star Wars as a kid. But it's a small role, and so, but yeah, so many great scenes. Let us know, guys, what are your favorite James Earl Jones moments in the chat? Uh, Maybe your favorite outside of Star Wars as well, because he had so many great roles. And that Big Bang Theory cameo is awesome as well. That's a great one. So we have a couple comments here in the chat around James Earl Jones. Anthony says, "Rest in peace, James Earl Jones. He'll truly be missed. Absolutely, he will." Tahuaroa says, "I feel the passing of James Earl Jones is one of those 'how did you hear about this death' moments for Star Wars fans." Yeah, absolutely. You always remember where you were when you heard that he passed away. So it is sad for all of us. But 93 years old, he lived a great long life, and we were lucky to have him around for this long, and he was such a great ambassador for the Star Wars franchise. So that is sad news. On top of that, we don't want to gloss over the passing of John Cassidy, who also died yesterday. Um, a comic book artist. Not as many people know about John Cassidy as James Earl Jones, obviously. Comic book artist, but he helped launch the 2015 Star Wars run with Jason Aaron. That's his big contribution to Star Wars for the most part. Incredible art. So any of that art you see, those iconic covers from the first part of that run, was all John Cassidy's work. But as a big fan of comic books, his work stretches beyond Star Wars. I mean, far beyond Star Wars, right? And one of my favorite series that people have been talking about making a TV show of forever, and it never gets made, and it's so good. Planetary. Planetary is an amazing comic book, and he was the artist behind Planetary with Warren Ellis writing. Such great stuff for DC. He also, I believe, drew X-Men, Astonishing X-Men with Joss Whedon, which is one of the iconic X-Men runs of the 2000s. So such a legendary artist as well. And he passed away very young, 52. So I think they still haven't revealed all the circumstances around his passing, but another very sad loss here for the Star Wars community again yesterday. Any thoughts on John Cassidy before we move on to our next story?
Yeah, I mean, that is almost like the curse of being a comic book artist. You're not always like respected while you're doing your craft, while you're in the prime of your craft. Obviously, he had a lot more to give because it wasn't that long ago when Star Wars 2015 started. Like, sure, 9 years ago or something, but he had an incredible career. He was part of the start of Star Wars kind of coming back to Marvel and getting 1 million copies for that first issue.
Yeah.
Comics today for Star Wars are popular again in a way that they weren't since like the early Dark Horse era or like the prime of that like late 70s, like between episode 4 and 5. So yeah, like I know people always talk about Star Wars comics like, oh man, these latest runs have been like too many crossovers, like the Marvel characters and all that. And like, yeah, fair criticisms. But it all started off with a bang, with the very, very like New Hope inspired, obviously canonically falling comic, and his art for that is great. Like it really puts you like you see that cover, you're like, man, like that's Star Wars, right? Like that's what made people think of Star Wars in 2015. That's what Disney nailed for sure. Like just the original trilogy vibe for every piece of multimedia around that time. And it's definitely one of the most underrated covers, right? I think it's just one of the best looking ones in general. So I think his older brother said that he was in the hospital for a few days and his organs seemingly are okay, his organs and heart, but his brain, I believe he might have been brain dead for the last like day or two. So they tried everything. Again, that's not 100% confirmed. This is just Facebook post from his brother, but yeah, man, like it sucks, and especially like knowing that it's his older brother who's got to like kind of tell this on his personal Facebook account. Yeah, like, you never wanna see someone younger than you pass away, and especially not your family member, so, yeah, I mean, people would say in the comic book industry, like, he was someone that, like, they always revered, who was super helpful, really helped push them in their own starts too, so, Yeah, I hope that his legacy, like with Planetary and all that, really gets to take another step forward, with adaptations and all that, so that way people can, remember him in the same way that we remember like other Star Wars legends.
Yeah, absolutely. Great work. And it is sad. It's sad for the comic book community, but he is Planetary is so good. People need to read that more. It's kind of one of those things. It's a weird it occupied a weird era of DC Comics when they were transitioning from the Wildstorm imprint into just fully being Vertigo imprint. So yeah, very interesting time for DC Comics, but it's a great little series, especially if you like sci-fi or like pulpy film. There's a lot of references to some really fun things from like the 50s and 60s and yeah, very cool series. Definitely check it out. But yeah, so the sad stuff out of the way. Let us know, everybody, what your thoughts are on the passing of James Earl Jones and John Cassidy. We'll mention your comments here on the stream. And then without further ado, let's also talk about this other story before we get fully into the comments, because this is I think a fairly big story just in what it means for one of the next Star Wars series that we've talked about. And it's the fact that Disney's getting sued over Peter Cushing's image rights from Rogue One. Yes, Rogue One, which came out back in 2016, 8 years ago. They're now getting sued by a smaller film company, Tyburn Film Productions, who's claiming they own the rights or didn't allow Disney to use the rights for Peter Cushing's image for Rogue One. Basically, main reason I want to talk about this is if it doesn't seem like it's going to go anywhere. It seems like Disney will most likely win this lawsuit. But if for some reason they didn't, this could damage not just seeing Grand Moff Tarkin in the future of Star Wars projects, but one of the ones we thought we might see him very soon because of Krennic's involvement, because of all the returning characters from Rogue One being in Andor season 2. I thought Tarkin was kind of a shoe-in to be in Andor season 2 at some point, but with this going on, is there a possibility they cut out Tarkin or just he's not able to be in the show anymore? What do you think, Sonic, based on this news?
I think if it were to be affecting Andor season 2, it would be a pretty easy cameo that they could cut out. They could play it really like Catalyst, where they are sending these very heated emails basically back to each other, voice recordings, whatever. Like they could do something like that if they didn't necessarily need to show his likeness anymore. I don't think the likeness rights, from my understanding, would include like using a respeecher or some sort of AI enhanced or generated voice. So you could do that, and you can probably get the same point across. You could even just do like script revisions and have it be like, okay, Tarkin requires you to show up here, or reply back, like one of his aides for Krennic saying that, just see Krennic's reaction, and you get kind of the same thing there, right? Like, good enough. Or you can, if you really want to, pull the old Revenge of the Sith trick where you pull prosthetics onto an actor who looks vaguely close to, the visage of a younger Tarkin, and at this point you just play straight up Tarkin, because I don't expect him to be really in the first batch of episodes or that first year of Andor season 2. uh, do it from a distance or something, and like you just see Krennic walk in and you hear the voice, and before it turns away, cut away. Like there you go. Like you solved the issue there. So I don't think it'll be that much of a problem, and I think because it is more specifically an issue regarding Rogue One, right? There might have been a little bit more paperwork completed, a little bit more clarification on the rights for future appearances past that with the family, with the estate. So I don't think it would affect Andor season 2 personally. But in the case it does, I think it's very easy to work around it. But I think it does, like, at least play up the idea that it's not bad per se to go for recasts, right? Like, you're already seeing people in general just getting really upset at AI art, the AI news generation and all that. Like, there's an estimate that I read somewhere that, like, about 57% of images on Google search now are just AI generated or AI affected, and it's just like, yeah, like, it is, at the end of the day, an incredible tool that is being used in entertainment already in ways that we don't necessarily see publicly. But when used by everybody and with a really cavalier attitude, it really does limit the potential of it. It does really demonize it. It kind of takes away any positives of it. And in those situations where that happens, right, you have people making very strong arguments about like, why should we be doing this? Why should we go for another deep fake for a character when we have a Graham Hamilton instead of a Mark Hamill? And, that only strengthened those convictions of people, right or wrong, when there's a lot more nuance to it, right? And I personally prefer recast. That's just a fact. I prefer seeing a full performance uninhibited. But then what if like AI is better at like very complex prosthetics, like for example, like the montrails of Rosario Dawson's that she has to wear as Ahsoka, right? Like yes, they have a new 3D skeleton, but maybe like they're still feeling a little limited here and there, and it might be better just to do like some digital points or something. Are we gonna pull that into play? I don't know, right? Like, but it is a little bit of a slippery slope. Um, Ultimately, though, the fact that this is coming out 8 years later, I don't really think the person, if they really cared, like the friend who was like specifically told by Peter Cushing, like, "Oh, I never want this to be used by those people at ILM or whoever else," right? Like, I think that should have came up like in 2017 or 2016, right? Like 2018 even. 2024, I don't know. It feels like you're just adding a little fuel to the fire of like, really well thought out debates, but definitely filled with people who are just trying to slant one way for their position or whatnot when we're still learning how to best use this technology without diminishing the craftsmanship that obviously goes into filmmaking and goes into art. Um, yeah, I don't think there's a case, but even then, it's pretty easy to work around it.
Yeah, that's a fair point, and it does specifically reference Rogue One. So we'll see if this does carry over. And I am hoping to see Tarkin in Andor season two. I think getting um, all of the characters that really should be in this story has been something that's been a strong suit of Andor so far. They haven't really held back on bringing people in who should be a part of this story, and so I am hoping for some Tarkin, but hopefully we get it. We'll see. We'll see what happens with this lawsuit and what the ultimate outcome is. But now we're going to go back to the chat, and we do have Trent in the chat who said his favorite role from James Earl Jones is the King in Coming to America, which is another really great role, another one of his most iconic live action roles for sure. So that's another good shout there. But we're going to get back into the chat starting from the top. So again, guys, most of this stream will run from the chat. We do have a couple more topics we will and can cover based on your guys' chat. But we will be mostly focusing on the chat. This is another Ask Us Anything week. So make sure you guys keep sending in stuff to the chat and we will get to it first come, first serve. If you want to make sure you get a chat on today's stream, send in a super chat and we will answer that immediately. All right, let's go back to the top. Anthony Tiff says, have you guys seen or played Space Marine 2? It looks really good. Can't wait to play it. But I can't play it yet because I don't have a PS5. I need to get it. I have not played it. I have not played any of the Warhammer games. And I know your next question was, are you guys into the Warhammer 40K universe? It's so expansive, more so than Star Wars. It took my friend 2 years to learn everything. And there is books and comics and video games. Yeah, it's a massive universe. It's one I've never gotten into. Sounds very cool. Sounds like something right up my alley. But never have gotten into it. I don't game on PC, so most of the Warhammer games are only available to game on PC. And then I've never really been into like board games and playing RPGs and stuff like that. So I have not gotten into anything about Warhammer, but I am looking forward to the the series that Henry Cavill's working on because I know he loves it very much. So maybe that'll be my entryway one day into it. But yeah, at this point, it's like to get into the games and the lore, it'll really take a lot of effort, and I I don't know if I need another universe to jump into quite yet. But what about you, Senek? Any Warhammer that you've ever played in video game form or RPG form?
Nope, can't say I have. I do like just going on wikis and reading lore and stuff like that. It is a very grim, dark universe. It is very cool, very macho. It's some very delineated roles for characters and different species. It's very interesting to know that like there are basically just dark elves, just but like in a sci-fi setting. It almost feels like Starfinder, which is like just the space version of Pathfinder, which is in of itself like a version of D&D 3.0 or 3.5 that spun off once the rules started changing for 4.0 and all that. I played D&D for a good while. I haven't played recently, but that is kind of where my entry point is for board games. I've always wanted to kind of go into some sci-fi RPG at some point, but I think if I ever were to do that, it'd be something like on this channel with like a Star Wars RPG, because it's always nice to read those booklets for any sort of RPG, but like Star Wars RPGs have been like the basis of like so much lore and so much connectivity between books and comics and everything. And I think that'd just be a great place to really like dive in to like just even more obsessive detail about Star Wars more than we already do on the channel. Um, Warhammer, from what I understand, with Amazon and Amazon Prime, they're not really getting the approval between Cavill and the workshop for like the story elements that they'd want to do. And I mean, that guy's just got terrible luck, right? Like, yeah, I know like there has been like some things about like, oh, maybe he's just a little too stubborn about things and kind of resistant. But I don't know, man. At this point, it's just bad luck. It's just nothing's working out his way. And this is the one thing that I would have loved to hear his voice on. I wasn't entirely sold on him kind of becoming like a very major creative figure in storytelling, seeing that he doesn't necessarily have that experience, just more as like someone who can just make sure that like lore and detail and richness and adaptation is more consistent than something like say a Witcher is. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's to be determined. I would hope that with the success of like stuff like Fallout and all that, that the people behind Warhammer are like, oh yeah, like this is a great way to do it. But I also do understand the story, the universe, the grimdark. It is kind of hard to like really visualize truly outside of video games. Like even seeing Space Marine 2's trailer and all that, like to just pull that off would be like saying, let's do like what Fallout did in like its best action scenes, but like consistently body builds, everything. It's hard, right? And I don't know if they necessarily want to do animation, but it probably would still be the best place to do it. So it's a tough answer. I want to get into it, but I think I also need to get back into D&D, then into a Star Wars RPG, then Warhammer before I kind of go into any of these sort of auxiliary things. I'd love to hold a Warhammer miniature. That's what they're really known for still.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds very cool. I've always heard great things, and I know people really do love it. But it'll be a while before I jump into that universe. But let us know if you guys really love it. Maybe I can be convinced at some point. I do really want to get into some tabletops because it's something probably the biggest avenue of the nerd world that I haven't actually traveled down.
It's worth it.
I've done so many other things. So, yeah. But let us know what your guys' thoughts are on that. And then Anthony also says, "What consoles do you guys have?" I have a Nintendo DS, a Nintendo Switch Lite, Wii U, PS3, PS4, and Xbox 360. Favorite is probably PS3 or Xbox 360. I have like all of them. I have every Nintendo console, I have every PlayStation console, and every Xbox console. And then I have a Genesis, and a Dreamcast. I love console gaming. It's been something I've loved since I was young. My first console was a GameCube, or unless you're counting handhelds, then my first console was a Game Boy Advance. And then I got a GameCube, and then a PS2, and then it just kind of avalanched from there. I go to the flea market all the time, as you can see on my other channel, or I do with my pickups and stuff. I'm always going to flea markets or thrift stores, and I get this stuff for cheap, and I love collecting it and playing old games. And it's been a hobby of mine since I was 8 years old. So, yeah, I've accumulated all of that over the years. But the PS3, Xbox 360 generation is a great one. It is one of the more nostalgic ones for me. It was the one, we grew up with really in our formative years. The most nostalgic for me is probably the GameCube, but that was when I was playing those games, it was towards the end of the GameCube's lifespan. And so those are very nostalgic years, but not necessarily something I grew up with as much as my PS3 and my Xbox 360 and my Wii. And then, but yeah, it's hard to pick a best generation. It is, I think, for games wise, um, every generation is pretty good. but uh, but yeah, Xbox 360, PS3 is a great generation. And I'm glad you enjoy all those. You definitely got to get a PS5 and jump into the newer Star Wars games as well on the newer consoles. Although, didn't it? I saw today, and I didn't even realize this.
Yeah.
They're porting Jedi Survivor to a lower console, which makes no sense to me, to PS4 and
Uh,
Xbox One. Um, that makes no sense. Like it really does. Are that many people still playing PS4 only that they are like we can make enough money doing this, and why not just do it digital only? I don't know. It's really interesting.
it's a weird thing too because, when we were growing up with that PS3, Xbox 360, Wii generation, backwards compatibility started first like being explored as like let's not do that built in, right? Like
Hmm.
PlayStation was notorious for not really being backwards compatible with PlayStation 2 other than like maybe the first 2 years of the versions of the consoles. And if you waited for like a PS3 Slim like I did, yeah, you could not. You had to get them digital downloads. I know there was like some workaround where like you could like put in some copies and like get it approved to get like some digital version, but it was such a hassle at that point, right? So I think back then, right, 10, 15 years ago, right, like it was a little easier to justify like, hey, let's do a game for that current console generation or that last console generation 'cause, the architecture was a lot easier, a lot similar generation to generation. It was just like you're taking a leap up in certain facets, but you weren't necessarily reworking the whole wheel. But then, that Sony kinda changed the game, like, the PlayStation 3 architecture even today is considered, like, the most overtly complicated one ever, and it's like that's why they changed things so drastically for 4 and 5 that kinda went back to the same philosophy they had for 1 and 2, and especially for me, like, with the PS2 Slim, which, I still to this day regret ever giving up because that thing was so fun and easy to carry around.
Hmm.
Like, that's like a it's like a book. It was so nice. Alright, ironically, I sold a Battlefront 2 game cover, but not the
Uh,
game itself. I don't know how that
oh,
happened.
what?
But, yeah, I have the game, I just don't have the cover anymore, but, um yeah, I think it was a little bit more justifiable before everything was streaming based. Like when that generation was out, there was something like called GameFly, which was
Yeah,
advertised everywhere about like how you can like use this device and play cloud gaming. And like these are things that we now just fully embrace or and still have problems like with Google's cloud gaming platform. But
yeah,
then it was a gimmick that, like, you'd be sold on for a while. You're like, "I can own this game for a month and then get another one," and then it just didn't work out. So, yeah, it made a lot of sense to stick with your console until you get the one that you wanted at the right price point and all that. Now we live at an age where a PlayStation 5 Pro, which is basically useless, is now $700 starting point, and it's like, "What are we doing here?" Right? Like, our PlayStation 3 was so expensive. Xbox One X into Xbox Series X, right? Like, that was a whole mess too, and then Series X is supposed to be super connected with Windows PCs, like, the concept of consoles has it's gone away, right? So, uh, you could say it's really just Nintendo that's got it locked down because they don't fight over hardware and specs like that anymore. Now they're like, "Let's just go with the experience, the immersiveness, the type of games that you expect from us." So I got a lot of respect for them, and I think that's why besides the PlayStation 2, which was my first ever console, the DSi was actually my first handheld. I would just borrow Game Boy SPs and stuff like that, and DS Lites. I love the DSi, even though it actually just was Nintendo's first foray at, like, getting rid of, like, backwards compatibility without having a Game Boy Advance cartridge and all that. I know technically the Micro didn't either, but, I still love handheld gaming. I think that's probably the only console-ish gaming I do, and now that's kinda all merged in with the Switch and the rumors of the Switch 2 coming out and being announced for next year. I'm finally trying to catch up on my Pokemon games after falling off after, like, halfway going through Pokemon X, so I bought myself some, like, cheap case version. It's definitely not the original case of a DS Lite, but now I can say I own my DS Lite, And then I modded a software modded a new Nintendo 3DS, a little scratched up here and there, but now I can play everything from Fire Red all the way up till Pokemon Ultra Sun. I believe that's what I have. Or I might or Ultra Moon. I don't know which one I got. So that's my foray getting back into console-ish gaming. I know it's not technically, but um, I think after that PS3 generation in middle school, like with Black Ops, and realizing I kind of hate how toxic that gaming was, I played League of Legends on my computer, which was another level of toxicity, and I finally quit it, even if it was addictive. So console gaming hasn't been great for me. I've moved off of it completely, but now I have a gaming PC, and I've been using gaming laptops over the years. So that's where I played Fallen Order. That's where I played Survivor. That's where I'm playing Outlaws. That's where I have Cyberpunk and all these things. I'm just kind of now on that. It's a little easier for me, and it's easier to justify replacing hardware every 2 3 years because it's just a component instead of kind of what these consoles are, which are increasingly becoming more parts based, swappable, extra memory slot, all that. So yeah, long-winded way of saying I used to be, but not so much.
Skywalker's Academy says hello there. Tahuaroa says Thursday afternoon with the lads. Then corrects it to Wednesday afternoon. I'm glad you're enjoying your Wednesday afternoon. Still Tuesday evening for us. Uh, Trent says, "Heyo, hi Trent." And then Anthony says, "Smash the like button." Yeah, absolutely, smash that like button. Helps us out a lot. And then Darth Revan asks us our thoughts on. I knew this was going to come up, and I don't know much about it. Uh, Darth Revan asks us our thoughts on the Star Wars Theory, Star Wars Explained drama. I am completely being honest. I have no idea anything that's going on other than what Sanak has told me. um, but yeah, I don't usually get into YouTube drama. I don't really have any horse in the race. Um, but yeah, I usually try to avoid it because I don't want either of their minions coming and attacking us on our channel. We're trying to keep this a place for everybody to talk Star Wars. So I don't know how deep we'll get into it, but I'll pass it over to you, Senek, for kind of maybe a brief summary of what's going on and some of your thoughts. But I have really no opinions.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a case of social media and Twitter more so than YouTube. I think it's pretty fair to criticize YouTube and kind of how it's been enforcing some content, how its algorithm works over the years. Clickbait, outrage, those types of videos, regardless of franchise, regardless of topic, it usually just does better, right? Like a channel like us, we've always talked about it. If we went full negative, if we went super spammy on our thumbnails and all that, it's just a fact. That's how the algorithm kind of rewards things, right? And even some of the most positive channels do that to certain degrees, and we've ridden the line as best as we could while still being as authentic as possible because it is kind of just how YouTube works, right? They'll even recommend now with a new tool of like, okay, this thumbnail would be a little bit more positive. You'll push a few more elements out there that people will pick up on, right? Like it is just the fact of the YouTube algorithm kind of pushing things that are more out there, bolder, a little bit like too extreme sometimes. But what this really is I guess Molly, one of the two Star Wars Explained alongside with Alex. They're married. She just supported out a petition that called for demonetization of some of these channels that have said slurs that have been very sexist, misogynistic towards the actors behind Star Wars, like Amanda Stenberg, right? Not necessarily anything about like channels that what they're creating, just more like why are we fueling this fire? This was not their, it was just a petition, whatever reasoning they had or not, she sent it out there just supporting like, yes, I've seen that in the community, especially on social media and all that. And then a big thing that happened was Team YouTube like reviewed that petition going around and said like, oh, we didn't find any fault in the video, right? So not a very pleasing thing for people who are seeing minorities, not necessarily be well treated in this community, right? I'm a little bit more aware of that, but it sucked, but that's kind of where the book closed, and you're like, okay, well, that's just YouTube being YouTube. Then Theory, from my understanding, kind of responded, made a video that like shared some private DMs that he had and emails over the years with Star Wars Explained. Just was it's just a very generally toxic and negative thing, and I don't really want to get more into it other than like it was a closed book and then it's been reopened. It's been reopened today again as well, just because Molly and Alex have responded a little bit here and there on the socials. But yeah, like now they've had to like close all their comments and moderate heavily their comments on their channel for just live Q&As and stuff. And it sucks because, even if they were to some degree a little misguided for like pushing that out there, and I'm not going to make a comment whether or not they were really. The point is like, they are like such encyclopedic Star Wars fans, like the lore that they do, the commitment they have to covering every finite detail of Star Wars, it should be applauded. Now it's kind of become a thing about like who Star Wars is the right Star Wars, who Star Wars is the best Star Wars, and we have our opinions. We're not the biggest fans of theory, but it sucks that instead of like coming together, what are the things that make us all Star Wars fans? Like, what are the things that are common between us? This is just kind of how the fandom has been since The Last Jedi. This is just kind of how social media and YouTube is used, and it sucks, right? So like, there's that question a little later on in the chat, like, are you worried about like how once you grow bigger, how your audiences will be and all that? Yeah, I mean, we've already seen some sort of stuff like that on our channel. We'll point it out, we'll call it out, especially if it really like relates directly to us. But yeah, we didn't really want to insert ourselves into it. We discussed it. We're like, let's hold off. A lot of stuff online is reactive. That's not really what we're here for. We're here to make a community that, as long as you're genuinely trying to talk about Star Wars, critical or not, but like you're not resorting to such, crude remarks or like attacking people's personalities and what they like about Star Wars, like why should we get involved in that? You can call that fence sitting, but we still, supported people and their rights and supported people who have been marginalized. That's how we're always going to be. That controversy, I'm just sad that that's happening right now. I wish Star Wars Explained, weathers it out and, we don't talk about it in a few days. Um, it doesn't seem like that. So that's about all I can say.
Yeah, I don't have anything else to add. All I'll say is that when we're not a big Star Wars channel, and we want to keep this channel a place for everybody to discuss Star Wars. And so we're sticking to our guns. We don't have a horse in this race, and so whatever it is going on, they can deal with it. And we're going to stick to what we enjoy about Star Wars, which is actually talking about Star Wars and not talking about all the craziness around it.
Yeah.
So moving on to Anthony, who says one thing is frustrating about YouTube. Yeah, so we kind of just talked about that in that last comment. And then let's see, scrolling down through here. Anthony says recently bought some old Mass Effect comics written by John Jackson Miller. How are they? Are they any good? I've never read any of the outside Mass Effect stuff. I know we talked about this before because you have Commander Shepard as your icon. But yeah, I love the Mass Effect games. Never really gotten into the rest of the world. But yeah, I'm sure they're good. If John Jackson Miller worked on them, he is consistently very good with his work. Matthew Gaudette says, I was sad when David Prowse died, but gutted when James Earl Jones passed. The original era for Star Wars is coming to an end as it reaches its 50-year milestone. Nothing lasts forever. Grateful to George. The force be with you. Well, thank you for that very nice comment. And yes, it is. This is a continual reminder that everybody is getting older every year. Things are constantly changing. I mean, even some more shocking passings like Carl Weathers is passing this year. We've had a lot of passings in the world of Star Wars, but now we have no Kenny Baker, we have no Carrie Fisher, we have no James Earl Jones, no David Prowse. It is shrinking, this cast from the original trilogy. I mean, plus obviously the ones that were already older when they made the movie, like Peter Cushing and Alec Guinness, and we lost Peter Mayhew a few years ago. So it is getting sad that we are starting to lose some of these icons, but we're grateful for all the incredible memories they've given us over the years. Anthony says the comics were pretty good about a third of the way through them. Well, let us know in future streams what your thoughts are on those. Mass Effect would be one world that I guess I may get in. I would consider getting into further stuff, um, because I did love those games when they came out, but it's been years since I played them. But while we're waiting for more comments to roll in, and again, everybody, this is an Ask Us Anything. So send in anything else you'd like to talk about in the chat. First come, first serve. Whatever you would like to discuss doesn't have to be Star Wars, can be Star Wars, can be about any of the topics we've already discussed, can be about the topics we're going to discuss, could be about anything you'd want. So keep sending those into the chat and we'll keep making those the focus of today's show. But let's get to this other news story because this kind of is the next thing we're going to be talking about. And we're planning on doing a full review next week of Outlaws on the live stream. So stay tuned for that. And then we'll cut it up for a little individual video. But there has been a lot of talk about Outlaws and its performance overall. And we're going to give you our thoughts now from where we are currently in the game. But Outlaws hasn't been doing as well for Ubisoft as they were hoping. I always felt like, just in general, as an aside, before we talk about the review scores and all the other things, I always felt like the end of August is a really strange time to release this game, right? Usually you have major AAA games release in end of October, November, and December. Usually those are the games most studios are most confident in. Even Ubisoft is usually releasing their Assassin's Creed games and is releasing an Assassin's Creed game at that time. I would only imagine that they just didn't want to release two games at the same time of the year. But end of summer has always been a bad time to release things, just from the film industry, all of that. Kids are going back to school. People aren't really playing video games as much as they were during the summer or in the fall, getting closer to Christmas when people buying stuff. So just as an aside, I feel like that could be affecting the numbers outside of just game scores. But in general, the average game score for Outlaws hasn't been that great. It's been receiving, for the most part, between sixes and eights. Usually in the world of video games, as I said a couple weeks ago, like the Metacritic score for it is in the 70s. That's not great in video games. It would be great for film. It's not great for video games. I believe a 7 out of 10 on Metacritic is considered average, which is such a strange world we live in. Another aside, why is 5 out of 10 not average in anything, right? That should be average. It's halfway through. But yeah, anyway, we're getting to 7 out of 10 is average. It's more like a, school grade. And then overall, that has been affecting a bit of the game scores, and the developers haven't been happy with the scores. They feel like they've put a better game out there than the sixes and sevens and eights out of 10 they've been receiving. And due to that, Ubisoft's stock has crashed. It is not doing very well. It's down quite a bit because of the low sales numbers. I'm sure it won't really have much problem. And it's not just an Outlaws problem. It's also Skull and Bone and a bunch of these other games they've released this year that haven't been up to snuff in terms of their sales. But yeah, so Ubisoft, massive, all the things around Outlaws, definitely not leaving the mark they were hoping for. I think especially with this being the first open world Star Wars game. I mean, open world is still extremely popular. It's not a genre of video games that really is going anywhere anytime soon. It's one of the more addictive genres of video games, and people are just not really that interested in Outlaws. And I think there's a variety of reasons. But Sonic, what were your thoughts here, seeing how much Ubisoft stock has dropped and some of the comments that the directors and the people around Star Wars Outlaws have made, now seeing these kind of solidified scores around their game?
Yeah, I mean, even before going into like what I feel about the game, I don't think this was a game that was necessarily gonna be like, oh man, like this is the savior after EA's exclusivity has finished off, right? Like, no, like I think anyone expecting Outlaws to be anything other than like I'm just a really well made Ubisoft game, right? That still has all its obvious flaws and bugs was asking for too much. Like you said, Skull and Bones was a huge, huge miss, right? Like it has like incredibly low retention rate for any sort of game, and I believe it's a live service game too, which is like you need to have like a good audience and growing with it. It was supposed to be what's that other one, that other seafaring game that everyone play still.
Sea of
Uh,
Thieves.
Sea of Thieves, like, it was supposed to be the competition for that, right? That's what the whole purpose of that game was, like, Ubisoft really taking a good stab there, and yeah, it didn't happen, right? It kinda sucks for Ubisoft. I know there's been a lot of discourse online about the new Assassin's Creed 2. Obviously, I don't think that really affects the stock in any ways, but this was always a game kinda swallowed up by, like, the other things going around with the company, and then, like you said, a pretty interesting release date, and then it just being pretty average, right? Like, if it was, like, an 8 or a 9 out of 10, right, still somehow games that are getting, like, 81, 82 are still considered slightly above average, which,
Yeah.
boggles my mind. It would just that's just what the situation would have been. And it's the fact that it's a Star Wars game, right? Like, no matter what, there will be standards, there will be expectations. I think if anybody still has expectations and standards of us back in, like, 2013, when we first saw, like, that first DICE teaser for Star Wars Battlefront, you're not being honest with yourself. Like, Star Wars gaming for a lot of the late ages of LucasArts was really, really poor, right? Like, you could arguably say, like, the Star Wars Connect game was probably the biggest and the worst thing that they ever did, and that was very late stage for them. And then
Yeah.
from there, right, like, EA exclusivity for 10 years, which again never made sense because that's not how LucasArts really handled the games during their prime of, like, the late 90s, early 2000s. But, that's what happened, and we didn't get a lot of games. This is a generation where gaming, just like how anime has kind of dominated movies and TV shows, gaming has kind of dominated, like, a lot of realistic, interpretations of different content and different franchises. It should have been more massive, and I'll blame EA's failures leading up to Ubisoft, finally getting a swing at it with Outlaws. But I'm glad that there are things like, the game director coming out, like, with that first day one patch that just come out today or yesterday about, like, we're punishing people too much who are not really used to stealth, and that is a weakness of this game for people. If you are used to more of, like, a gunslinger route like you would get in, like, Star Wars: The Old Republic, Kay Vess is not really like that. She's more of, like, a thief, kind of like skulking about and then, trying to win, like, good deeds and, good reception from all these different syndicates and all that, and kind of being like that independent contractor of sorts. And that's not necessarily how the game was marketed either.
Yeah.
And definitely takes a while to get to a little bit more of, like, that. You can kind of go around on a rampage with the character. You're using Nyx a lot, and if you play into that playstyle, I think you really do enjoy it. But it takes a while if you haven't been used to that. Um, but yeah, I understand the criticisms. At the end of the day, though, I think the biggest thing is that it's just too damn expensive, right? Like, it's the fact that you have to pay like 120 to get, like, some extra skins and your season pass guaranteed and stuff like that. It's not great, right? You're already paying like $70 now for a game when it used to be 60. And I know that was a market adjustment that it was coming for a while, sure, but the gold edition of the game itself is, like, already basically $100, right? And you're like, okay, like, would I really want to pay 100 for a game that is, like, slightly above average at best? I don't think that's fair to be critical of that. I'm glad though that this is a game that seems like it's gonna have a nice 2 DLCs, with iconic characters like Lando. We're gonna get our
Hondo.
favorite captain back, Captain Hondo. I want to see how he's been treated, right? Especially with a lot of people who love Rebels still being kind of critical of, like, how he goes from all that power in the Clone
Yeah.
Wars to, like, just like some weird guy that, like, is just, like, very strangely dependent on Ezra's Jabba the Hutt. So it'll be very interesting to see, like, how he transitions to who he becomes, a little bit more of a gracious elder statesman in Batu in the sequel trilogy, and I think this could be, like, a good first step for that. Yeah, but I'm curious for how the game is gonna go. I think it's got a good roadmap. I think for sure though, like a lot of other people, the Ultimate Edition probably isn't selling as well because a lot of us, like myself, are using Ubisoft Connect and just playing it through that and are more willing to play like 2, 3 months, paying $17 and then being like, okay, I'll pick up the game again once the DLCs start coming up again. I'm not
Yeah.
gonna risk, playing a standard or gold edition or paying for that when I know that, like, my cloud saves will be specifically synced for the ultimate edition, which is what the Ubisoft Connect has. So Yeah, it's the price, it's the entry point for a game that, while pretty good, and I'm really enjoying myself in its immersion, it's not supposed to be like a big league swing hit in the same way that Battlefront and Battlefront 2 were supposed to be and weren't really by the end, right? Maybe Battlefront 2 at the very, very end, but then they stopped right when they could have gotten more maps and more character models and really gotten a huge audience during the start of COVID. So, yeah, that's how I look at it right now.
Yeah, and I think just generally, Ubisoft games always go half price by the time the holidays roll around.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people are waiting to buy it until then, which is not necessarily the best thing for your company to be known for because then nobody will buy it day one. I feel like even as a big Star Wars fan, if we weren't doing this for the show, I probably would have skipped out on it until at least Christmas because I just didn't hear. I was that really that excited for this, and then I just didn't hear that great of things leading up to it. And I would say, with all that, I have enjoyed the game more than I thought I would, which is, obviously a big plus. And I think that's going to help save Outlaws and kind of have that, we'll get that eventual push for like make Outlaws 2 happen, because I think people will pick it up when this thing starts to go on sale and go, hey, we heard a lot of negative things, but this game really isn't bad. It's just pretty average. And I agree with you that I think one of the things that's frustrated a lot of reviewers, and I'm glad I kind of knew it before I went in because it hasn't frustrated me as much, is the stealth element of this game. The fact they didn't really market that at all, I think, is baffling because they were completely kind of lying to the audience that this is not an action adventure game. Most open world games have the complete ability to run in guns ablazing, right? Even if, yes, you have to kill more enemies because of it, or yes, you have consequences, which this game does if you go in guns ablazing, because different faction will lose respect for you. But just the fact that so many levels lock you into having to do stealth, so many of the main missions in the game, not just some of the side content, you have to remain invisible or you have to start over. And the stealth is just extremely weak. I have to say that as somebody who has played almost every Assassin's Creed game up to Odyssey, and then Ghost of Tsushima and some of these Splinter Cell, some of these best stealth games that have ever existed. The stealth here is so bland. It consists of walking up and pressing, square or X or whatever your controller has, and then you instantly knock somebody out. And it is so goofy too because it's you have Kay Vess punching like a stormtrooper with her fist in the head. They didn't give her like a stun baton or anything really to taser, nothing to help make this a little more realistic. Not to mention that usually for me when I do takedowns, the sound is off and you hear the punch after she hits them, which is also kind of weird. I mean, even like having Nick's jump on their neck or something and they fall on the ground and she punches them, which does happen sometimes in some of the animations, but yeah, more often than not it's just like very unbelievable. And there's no other way to do stealth besides your one stun shot that takes forever to reload. So I think, yeah, just the fact that one of the main game mechanics is so mediocre has also led to more harsh reviews of this game than really it might deserve. And I think most people acknowledge the fact that this is atmosphere wise, this is arguably the best Star Wars atmosphere ever created in a game. The amount of stuff there is to do, there's more stuff here to do than pretty much any other Star Wars game ever. So there are a lot of positives, and I think the what is it, the faction system, I think that all is pretty cool. The way you can work different factions to get whatever you need and what you want, I think there's more depth to be had there. I would love something kind of like the system in Middle Earth Shadow of Mordor, where you can maybe recruit people to your factions. Maybe next game you can have your own faction, start your own faction to compete. There's a lot of depth to be had, and this is a very shallow game in a lot of ways. But ultimately, I do think this is better than the numbers show. And yes, and like I was wondering, I wonder if they take into account the amount of people they have on their subscription services in regards to their
Yeah.
sales? Because I mean, if a lot of people out there, and there are a lot of the biggest YouTubers for video games are telling people don't buy this game, pay for the subscription service. You are offering that service, you've got to include those in your numbers of sales. You got to know that if you have a subscription service that people can play a game with, it's going to lead to less people buying the game. So which one do you want to prop up more, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's interesting to see how much the stock has fallen. I think it's just a general lack of belief in the company's direction rather than just Star Wars Outlaws. But yeah, this should have been a bigger game. I did hear too from somewhere that this game was a 4-year total turnaround time from pitch to finish job, which is crazy fast in the video game industry, and that's kind of led to a lot of the surface level decisions in this game. But overall, I enjoyed it for what it was. The story is, I think, fairly simple Star Wars story. Like if you read a lot of Star Wars books or a lot of Star Wars comics or other Star Wars material, this is something you see done a million times. But it's given enough care to where I would like to see more and a you know doubly better game. But we'll give you our full thoughts next week. But yeah, I think those are some of the reasons why. And obviously the big elephant in the room as well is if this character had a lightsaber, I think this game sells better. Not that every character needs to have a lightsaber. I like that they went for something different as people who play every Star Wars game. It's nice that they went with something different, honestly. But I think if you're going to go with something different, they have to kind of nail that combat. And while the combat's better than I thought it was going to be, it's still relatively shallow. It's pretty basic. I mean, everybody now knows on the internet the stupidity of the dropping guns mechanic, which doesn't make any sense. The fact that you can pick up all these guns and then you just you try to hack a door and she drops it. You try to pet Nyx and she drops it. You punch somebody and she drops it. It makes no sense. So there's a lot of things that they could tighten up about combat. But yeah, they needed to nail the combat and they needed to nail the depth of the world. And I think overall, visually, that's the main thing they nailed. But um, there's a lot of room for improvement with Outlaws. And I think when people start buying this for $30, $20, $15, yeah, it won't really help Ubisoft's bottom line. But I think there will be people out there who realize that this is not really a bad game. It's just more of an average game. And
Yeah.
hopefully that does well for or bodes well for a future Outlaws
And
2.
I just want to add a little bit to like what you're saying. Like, yeah, I don't believe like their estimations, right? When which they've recalibrated down from like around 10 million. Now they're saying between 5.5 to 7.5 or something around like that, right? That is what's making people nervous, but like that doesn't include the subscriptions, right? So will this game turn it around? I think it will. I don't think it's like flawed in the same way Cyberpunk was, where it was just really messed up from the first
Yeah.
few months, like, incapable of running. But now it's like a really, really well sold game, and it's got a great DLC that people absolutely love. And I can't wait to like finally spend some time and jump into it. Right? I know you completed the game back when it still
Mhm.
had these flaws and problems, but people who've been able to pick up on it now after some discounts after the DLCs, right? They're like, yeah, no, like it's good now, right? And that's unfortunately that is the nature of AAA gaming now. Like things are made at such rapid rates that a game like Outlaws, seemingly has been able to keep things on a really nice timeline because, like you said, it's been a little shallow in some parts. I'm not going to deny that, but I'm still impressed by the immersion in areas that I expected them to make those cuts, right? Like I expected a little less about customization about your ship and all that, but it's quite really there. Like character customization, yeah, sure, you can't really change KVS, but you get to see some awesome outfits, and I thought they would have been very limited in that factor. So things like that, I agree, right? And it kind of sucks, right? In some ways, if you wanted to get like that full, maybe like Project Ragtag when that was still kind of being developed, with the creative director behind Uncharted, right? And that was set on Tatooine, and you were fighting similar things, like similar syndicate behavior, probably the Huts at that point, and it's a little bit more focused. Maybe that's where you would have seen more customization and a lot more like nitty gritty details about each planet, and like the worlds, the open worlds would have been like how the rest of Assassin's Creed's games are, like massively in scope, like Origins and all that. So I can understand that. But yeah, like not showing your subscriptions or like making a good like explanation that people are playing it through here. It's weird because it feels like streaming now, right? Where numbers are hidden
Yeah.
away, right? You don't really know the full totality of how well this game is going to be sold, and that doesn't bode well when you have competition like Black Myth Wukong, which is a Chinese game that had a lot of hype because it's obviously based off of Journey of the West with a little bit of a modern spin and flair. Obviously, people who are big into the video game discourse are pumping that game up, and by all accounts, it's a great game. But it doesn't have that streaming kind of option that you have with any Ubisoft game with Ubisoft Connect. So it's already sold 10 million in 1 week, which is incredible. Now the question is, are we going to see Outlaws with its strong foundation and its DLC grow closer and maybe eventually surpass that 7.5? Which that's not bad. Any game that makes over 5 million copies is excellent, right? That 10 million is an incredible feat for Wukong, but it's also like unprecedented to get that in 1 week in your opening week. So I'm very curious to see outside of China, like how the sales will be after like that initial hype wears off. And when we know and we have that history of Ubisoft games slowly growing over time. So it'll be interesting. It's a lot more nuanced and complex, like every topic and every issue is. And that's what we try to do on this channel, try to give our thoughts as best as we can. But yeah, we'll see how this game goes. It's just nice that it's a game that actually really respects its lore. I really do appreciate that. So if you're
Yeah.
someone who
Yeah.
loves modern day franchises that put an emphasis on video games to be as interconnected as possible, yeah, this is a game, especially on Akiva, so well connected to Aftermath and so well connected to a lot of the storytelling that is reaching its 10-year anniversary with the Battle of Jakku comics and everything kind of showing up now.
Yeah, no, that is completely true. This is a game that really not just respects the lore, but actively dives into it, continues to push it, and it broaches this kind of side world of Star Wars that we've seen not given as much care over the years, and now it's slowly getting more and more. There's nice little connections and winks and nods at the future stuff from post Return of the Jedi to all the stuff that's in between this era, from like War of the Bounty Hunters and Crimson Reign and Empire's End and or Hidden Empire, all that stuff. So yeah, this game on a lore level and on a visual design level is honestly 10 out of 10. Everything else I think leaves some stuff to be desired, and I think that's the reason that makes me want a bit or Outlaws 2 more than I would for most games of this quality, is the fact that it looks like the creative team genuinely has so much love for this game. And so, if maybe they're given a bit more time to make a better game, and if they're given, another chance to hone what they've started here, I think you could have one of the definitive Star Wars games of all time. As this stands now, it's a good game. It's exactly what I thought it was going to be, which is why I'm not disappointed. It's a good game that I don't really want to stop playing because I know it's something else. I probably will never play this again. But it's a good game and a fun like 15 to 30-hour experience, depending on how much you want to put into it. So, all right, back to the chat, everybody. So keep sending in those chats. We are at the hour and 10-minute mark almost. So keep sending in the chats. We'll get to as many as we can before an hour and a half. And if you guys want to talk about anything you want, it can be Star Wars, it can be not Star Wars, it can be anything in pop culture, it could be we love sports or music or anything you want to talk about. Send it into the chat. We would love to discuss it, movies, anything. All right. So Anthony says, where I lost where. Oh, Christopher Lee's passing. Yes, Christopher Lee passed a few years ago as well. Another classic member of Star Wars that we've lost. Tahura Roa says, does your YouTube analytics tell you which part of the world each viewer is viewing videos from? I'm watching from Brisbane, Australia. It does, but it's kind of a flawed system. And I know I'm happy for this for general life is YouTube relatively respects privacy, so uh, it will only tell us where people are from that are watching our videos if they have their accounts public. And to be honest, I'm not really sure how you even do that. How you confirm that you're public or private account. But if you're publicly subscribed to us or you have your account as a public profile, then we can see not specifically individual people who's from where, but it will just tell us like 5% of your viewers are from Australia, 5% of your viewers are from Germany, so we can get those numbers. But there, if you have your privacy settings on and you want to be a private account, then it won't tell us where anybody's from, or and it doesn't the individual information on any single viewer.
Yeah, and just to
Anthony,
add just to add a little aside to that, the only
no,
public
go ahead.
information that we kinda have, it's at actually YouTube. It would actually be, our podcasts, which, if you've been around for a long time, that's kinda how we started off. We didn't do videos till, like, May 2021 or something, so we had a few
Yeah.
months before that. So if you don't know, most of our videos are not like dependent on the visual elements. I make it a point of like putting onto the podcast. So we get to see like the general audience numbers, like, whoa, this person's from here, this person's from there, who's watching from which country. So yeah, like we have an overview in that sense. Like it's right now, it's still 80% US, but we got 3% UK and 2% Canada, 2% Australia and Germany, right? And we can see like which podcast platform people are using. Like right now, it's like 30 something for Apple, and then Spotify is like 7, web browsers like 15, right? So like we get details like that. And I think it's because podcasts are a little bit more anonymous in general. So you don't really have to like reveal much about yourself other than just the general area you're from. But I'll admit I can actually narrow down to like which percentage of someone in the US is hearing from. Like, okay, of that 80%, 50% are from Virginia and 30% are from California. Like we can get those details for that. So if you want to contribute to listening to us instead of simply watching us, yep, podcasts are always an option for you.
Anthony says favorite horror film. Well, Anthony, that's another one. Like a few weeks ago, when people were asking us what the best movies to start with are, if you're getting into film, that's another one I'm going to need to pull up my letterbox for to see. But I have an easy favorite horror film of all time. It's easy, and it's one that most people say, and it truly is to me by far the best horror movie I've ever seen. It's The Shining. If you have not seen The Shining, it's a masterpiece. It's a classic. It's Stanley Kubrick at his finest. I don't care about Stephen King's criticisms with it. It's a masterpiece of a film. Absolutely check that out. My second favorite would probably be Alien. That's another movie that's around my top 10 favorites of all time. I love that film. I've seen it probably 10 times, and every time I watch it, I love it even more. So those are two of my absolute favorites all time. I'm gonna try to pull up my horror watch history to see other things, but I've watched so many horror movies, and it's one of my favorite genres. But do you have a favorite, Anthony? Let us know your favorites. But Sonic, do you have any favorites off the top of your head from the horror genre?
For a while, I would have agreed with you about The Shining. I think it's now that I know a little bit more about King's dispute, right? And knowing that like the central antagonist, it's a little bit more tragic in the book than how it's kind of depicted in Kubrick. Which this is what Kubrick does. He takes any book and he basically makes his interpretation of it. And most people really can't complain because he's a genius. So a lot of his films are like that. So I still think Shining, watching it on Halloween was like one of the coolest experiences I ever had. Um, for me right now, my favorite is The Thing. Like it's great. I love The Thing. Saw it back to back. It's kind of like one of those films you almost want to watch. And I first watched The Cabin up in Yosemite. It's like it's perfect, right? It's like that film that works so well as much as horror does with isolation, but it is super disconnected, right? Obviously, being set down on Antarctic station, an Antarctic station, a research station, and you're seeing all this mystery and all that. It's frustrating that the prequel thing that they made kind of cut out all of its practical effects in order to put CGI effects. I want to see that cut and see if it improves the film and in any way, because I know people generally don't love it that much, but that is kind of the craziest part about the thing is that there is like an entire other story that they're like hinting at happening, and that's it works in that film because you're like, oh my god, things are freakier than you ever understand. It's that unknown, it's that mystery. You're just like, I don't know what's happening here, and like this has already been continuing. Just how far gone are we? And that's what like really makes the stakes go overdrive in that film. I know people don't actually love the prequel film because of that, but I do wonder what it'd be like with the practical effects, which apparently people really, really love. So, yeah, I'm a fan of that. I'm trying to think of like other. I watched the original Halloween. I really do like that. I think that is super well done. Um, I
It's
watched
amazing.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I don't love it. I know people really like it. I
I
think
like it a lot.
thematically it's strong. I think it's thematically strong. I just I feel bad saying this, but like everyone was so annoying in that film, right? Like I I I was not upset at the guy in the wheelchair when he died because I was so annoyed by him throughout the course of the film because he was whining every 2 seconds. Like I was just like, you know what? I'm happy. Like that's fine, whatever. So I wasn't upset about that. Yeah, Alien's always a great shout. I think I used to love Aliens more as a kid, but definitely Alien. Yeah, like just so good. Romulus was pretty solid. I think I want to watch Alien 3 finally, but it's maybe more the assembly cut and not the theatrical cut because Fincher disowns that project. There's so much that happened between Alien's massive success and then what Alien 3 was. But I like the idea thematically of Ridley being this continuously tragic figure until she finally gets her release, her freedom. But I am a little worried that even the assembly cut will be lacking for me in the way that Alien and Aliens both at least do something really strong with their new elements.
Mhm. Yeah, and, Anthony says, "I heard Alien Romulus was good." It is good. I
Yeah.
definitely recommend checking it out, especially in a theater. I think it will be far better in a theater than it would be at home. I saw it in IMAX, and it was awesome in IMAX, the sound especially, but I think that's, to me, easily the 3rd best Alien movie. I've seen every Alien movie, yes, even Alien versus Predator, and, yeah, that's easily my 3rd favorite. I don't hate Prometheus as much as most people do. I enjoyed Prometheus for what it was. I like it better than, Alien Covenant. Alien Covenant still I also kind of enjoyed, and then Alien 3 is not very good. And Alien what's the 4th one? Resurrection? Resurrection, I think? Yeah, that one, was really bad. Um,
Yeah.
one of the worst movies I've ever seen is Alien versus Predator: Requiem. That is so
Oh,
bad.
yeah. And I heard
You
it's
guys
like
should
a
not watch that.
direct sequel to Alien versus Predator, but like in all the worst ways.
Yeah, yeah, and then they decided to set the movie on, in like a, cat a small town in the woods, like Friday the 13th in an Alien movie, or when you have 2 sci-fi characters, you set it in a small town in the woods. Makes no sense. But here's a couple other ones I'll throw out there for you guys. So last night I actually rewatched The Exorcist, and it's been years since I've seen it. I think I had already seen it twice before last night, and it's so good. It's still a masterpiece in my opinion. The way it builds tension, just the effects as well for 1973, absolutely astonishing. And the fact that it's one of the few horror movies that truly goes in on character. It's a drama first and foremost, and I've always appreciated that about The Exorcist, and I appreciate its characters. I think Father Karras is one of the best characters in horror, and it's a great movie. If you haven't seen that, it certainly holds up. Out of all these like older horror movies, that's one that I think still holds up in its horror and shock value, just in its visuals, as well as it did back in the 70s, because it's so visually impressive and the practical effects are so good that it doesn't really age. So that's a great one. So if you guys haven't seen that, this is one that I watched for the first time last year, and I instantly watched it a second time like a week later. It's so good, and it technically is kind of the father of slashers, even more so than Halloween. Black Christmas. Black Christmas might sound like a goofy horror movie of Christmas. It is extremely effective, and I thought the way it creates atmosphere, it creates tension, what it builds around its killer, and the characters around it. Really good movie. Absolutely check it out. Obviously Psycho, Silence of the Lambs. The Lighthouse is one of my favorites, kind of horror adjacent, not necessarily exactly horror, but that's one of my favorite movies ever. I can't wait for Robert Eggers' Nosferatu this year. Halloween, like you mentioned, Sonic. That's a movie that I appreciated the first time I saw it. I think I've seen it every year since I saw it the first time, and now I'm probably over 10 watches of it at some point. And every year, I think I'm going to get away from watching it, and somebody I meet is like, "Hey, I haven't seen Halloween." I'm like, "Oh my god, you have to watch it." So we watch it, and that's a movie that I've just grown on me so much every year. It is such a great movie. Definitely check out Halloween. And then for zombie movies, obviously the Dead trilogy is great. Monster movies, the original Godzilla or Godzilla minus one, still hold up really well. And like you mentioned, Anthony, um, one of your favorite movies is Dracula from 31. All those early Universal monster movies, I think, hold up extremely well. Frankenstein. I like Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein more than Dracula, but Dracula would be my third favorite of those. I think they're all excellent, especially Bride of Frankenstein is kind of the best of the original Universal classics. So, and Wolfman is also really good. And you mentioned The Howling, which is an underrated movie as well. And then I really enjoyed it. Chapter One from 2017. I thought that was great. Wouldn't be in my favorites of all time, but I can see why you would have it in there. I think it's a really good movie. Excuse me. And as for horror creatures, you mentioned Christopher Lee playing Dracula and was on top of Count Dooku and Saruman. He also played Frankenstein in Curse of Frankenstein, which is a really underrated Frankenstein movie. I think a lot of those early Hammer horror films from the late 50s, early 60s that Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing pioneered, they're super underrated. And I really like the original Dracula, but I was blown away by how underrated Curse of Frankenstein is. Nobody really ever talks about that one. That is really, really good as well. Definitely check that out. But my favorite horror monster of all those, it's a tough one. I think I would lean Dracula from the classic movies, even though Frankenstein are my favorite movies. I think he's iconic. Frankenstein's monster is iconic, but I wouldn't say he's my favorite monster. Dracula or the Wolfman. I've always liked those two. And The Invisible Man's an underrated movie as well. The original Invisible Man. Have you ever had a favorite horror monster, Sonic?
I don't know, man. My favorite horror monsters are always the people, right? Like, there's never really been a monster per se. I guess you could say the alien from the Xenomorphs, right? Like that's just a wonderful design, just super rich conceptually. Even if it's a pretty simple idea, it's very phallic, so it's pretty easy to understand once you understand like what the imagery is all trying to direct you towards. Um, but yeah, I don't know. Like I guess I don't know. Outside of that, I don't think I have like a monster per se. I do like Nope, that the third film from obviously Jordan
It's a good
Peele,
one.
right? That's a really underrated one. That's one that definitely got stronger for me after like rewatching some clips. I've only seen it once before. Hereditary, like it's probably like there was a trend for a while of like elevated horror, which I'm kind of glad we've moved away from because it does get a little obnoxious sometimes, where it's like it's not really that much thematically different. You're just using a lot more Northern European legends and imagery. That's kind of all it is to me once I take a step back from it. But for a while, it really had a grip. It really had a grip with Ari Aster. I mean, I remember coming out with a housemate from Hereditary just like at midnight, and I was like, I'm scared. Should we run home? It was in downtown. We did not live in downtown. It was just that's a great one for sure. Midsummer, I think it's good, but, like, not as good as Hereditary. Like, it's good for a different way, but it doesn't feel very horror-y. It's more dramatic to me. Um, I will say this is not exactly pure horror, but, it's more crime and thriller, but The Cure, by Kurosawa from the '90s, it's a Japanese horror film. Some of the greatest horror imagery I've ever seen. I really wanted to get into Japanese horror, and that was like my first entry point. I fear nothing will ever top it. Like it's top three or top four for me. That's how good it is for horror. Um, I guess if you want to go for more like story and then that has horror elements, I always love Black Swan, and I love Bones and All. That's like a romance almost, Bones and All, which um, It's a little gruesome, but I really like it. It's a very good reflection of America and Americana as a concept. Um, I love Dawn of the Dead. Like you mentioned, the Dead trilogy. Day of the Dead super underrated, but Dawn of the Dead is so well realized. Um, I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think what else.
The
I
Witch.
like the Witch. The Witch is good, but I think the Orphanage by
That's a good
Bayona,
one.
that's a good one. It's in Spanish, but super super tragic of an ending. Like I really like that. It was probably one of the first horror films that I really sat down and watched because it was like in class. So I was like, why not? But I really like that. That really was like one of my first forays into horror before like I've kind of really got into the last few years. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was also another good one. I think that has a lot of horror elements. It's very old school, but I think it does really work still quite well. I'm trying to think. I do like Talk to Me. That's another one. It's a film, Australian from last year. Not like super super great, but it's from YouTubers who turned into filmmakers. I mean, I'm always going to give credit for
Mhm.
that. That's incredible of a leap. I know people are talking about Chris Stuckman. We have not seen that film from him yet. I don't know where it's been
Uh,
released.
yeah, I don't think it's
Yeah.
wide released.
I think
Yeah,
maybe at a TIFF festival or something. Probably that probably was the most recent big name release place. I would love to catch that, but like these are
yeah.
I forget the name of the guys, but they're Australian guys who like are known for like insane humor, but also like action and stunt work. They used to be in like a lot of videos. Like they have their the most famous one I think is the Harry Potter versus Star Wars one. And it's Raka or something. I forget the name of the channel. But like they're the ones who made Talk to Me. They're doing a sequel to it. That's very underrated. Really, really well done modern horror. Original Scream is great too. I love that first Scream
One of my
film.
favorite
That's
movies ever.
so good, so good. Um, I mean, if you really want to add like pushing it, I'd say Jaws, but I never really consider it horror. It's just
It
more action
depends what,
adventure
yeah.
to me. Yeah.
It depends what you consider horror. If like I think if you want something with a monster that's and a heavy intensity and lots of thrills, then Jaws certainly fits horror, but it's not created with a horror tone or vibe. It's very
Yeah.
sunny, it's bright, you know. I mean, there's a lot of fear around it, but it's yeah. So those are a lot of great ones. Yeah, there's we could go on forever. You caught one of my favorite topics on here that you could possibly do, and especially because right now I'm starting to. Last year I did 31 movies in 31 days for Halloween with my horror marathon, so I'm starting earlier this year because it's the only way to go with more. Um, but yeah, certainly could talk forever about all these classics. But yeah, thanks for the question. We appreciate it, and hopefully we'll talk more horror in the future live streams. Um, where were we here? Matthew Gaudette says, I hope Indiana Jones is good. They hardly ever make indie content the new game. I wanted new comics and reprints of the old ones at Marvel, and animated series, more movies or TV. Yeah, I'd love more Indiana Jones too. I hope the game is good. I have very little faith, just in general, um, because I don't. Well, recently Bethesda's track record hasn't been the greatest, but I don't know. I just don't really like the idea of a first-person Indiana Jones game. But it looks like it'll be a fun story, and if the combat's good enough, it'll engross me enough to try it out. But I think like Outlaws, even though it's one of my favorite properties of all time, Indiana Jones, that is, even though it's one of my favorite properties of all time, I'm not sold on it being an instant purchase for me. I'm not going to just buy it because it's Indiana Jones. I'm going to wait to hear if people like it before I buy it, because as much as I love indie, games are expensive nowadays, and it's just not worth it to invest your money into something that's not that good. I'm going to wait until it goes on sale. And I think Outlaws for me was kind of that same way, where I wasn't that excited about it. I probably would have waited for the half price sale. But I'm glad I have it. I've enjoyed playing it, but I don't know if I'm going to rush out because we're not going to review Indiana Jones for the channel. So, but I do hope it's good. And I'm surprised Marvel hasn't announced an omnibus for the Indiana Jones comics, because they did make a lot of them in the 80s, and they were quite fun. I have a lot of the singles for Indiana Jones. An animated series, I never thought about that, but that could be fun with Indiana Jones, or some side characters, maybe a short round animated series, something, create a little universe here, have Indiana Jones make cameos. that would be fun. I would love to see more stuff in that world. I think the problem with that world is just the title of it is Indiana Jones. So if you do other characters, is it Indiana Jones anymore? Even if it is that same vibe or same tone, it might as well be a new franchise, right? So we'll see what they decide to do with in the future. But I think a lot of future Indiana Jones content is probably hinging on the fact or on if this Bethesda game does do well. And if it doesn't, if it bombs, the movie last year didn't do very well. Indiana Jones might be kind of all but dead outside of the original films, continued legacy and the amazing rides at the Disney parks.
Yeah, I think one thing that is keeping me let's keep some tabs on this game. Like if it's something I really want to play, is the nice fact that narratively it's supposed to be very super connected to be like almost like an essential bridge story between Temple of Doom going into obviously the original, Raiders of the Lost Ark. So the Great Circle, it has a lot of different famous monuments that was like be connected to. It's different than other indie games where it's like that's a nice adventure. Like I know there's one that's about like the lost city of Atlantis that people really love, but they're like standalone. They're not like you don't really need to know. There might be some cameos from characters, right? That kind of love in the same way that we got cameos in the last two Indiana Jones films. But yeah, I'm of that same boat. I'm not sure if I love the idea of having Indiana Jones in first person. Nolan North does sound great though. The trailer voice for a little, I was like a little worried, but the more previews that I've seen, like he's been nailing it, and the humor in the cutscenes, which of course they got great models there. I don't understand why you don't just make it third person or give that third person option, but that's what they want to do. That's what they want to do. It's almost the same issue as like Cyberpunk. Why wasn't it third person if we're going to have this great customization of our character, all this different tech and everything? Hopefully, maybe they add a camera angle. Maybe they've just locked it away, or at least make it worth such a good game that you don't even think about it. But we'll see. I'm excited for the narrative possibility of the game as like a way to continue and kind of flesh out the story because I've kind of come to the conclusion just from seeing the last two indie films that like Indiana Jones is most potent in the 1930s, 1940s. It's kind of after that he's already slipping away because conceptually he's not supposed to be like this incredibly good guy. Like his relation with Marion's a little weird, it's a little inappropriate. He is also like a Tomb Raider, right? He is doing these things that aren't great. And his whole conversation and dialogue with the villain of the first film, that French archaeologist, is like, yeah, you can say we're two sides of the coin, but I'm clearly the better side. You're the one who's more messed up. Like, it belongs in a museum conceptually. Maybe it doesn't sit as well with modern audiences who look at museums and history and how a lot of people curate and kind of put it together. So the peak of indie for me is in that period of time, the 30s and 40s, when those questions aren't there. It's once he kind of plays into like working for the CIA and all that, like you kind of lose me a little bit. So that's why I'm pretty happy with how the last film ended because I'm like, you know what? He was already losing steam. That's kind of the whole point of his character. He's never been the ultimate good guy. He's just always been the guy that super normal, put into these situations that nobody should be able to handle. He's beat up all the time, and that's why he's so endearing because he somehow manages to make his way out and be at least a better person at the end.
Jaden asks, "Is there a book club coming soon?" Well, we're planning on doing a Legends book club for all four of the Michael Stackpole Rogue Squadron, a quadrilogy that leads up to the Wraith Squadron stuff. Once Sonic wraps up the last couple books, we're gonna do one. Um, we'll pick a date soon and we'll let you guys know. But yeah, Legends Book Club is going to be moving to live. We've said that in the past. We're going to do a live format and we're going to do reviews of each book. So shorter videos, quicker thoughts, our scores, but to have an actual book club feel where you guys can talk about your favorite stuff in the books. We're going to do a live so you can all give your thoughts. So that's the answer to that. Badasai says, "Hey guys, good to see you. Nice mustache." Question: Someone sued Disney for Rogue One. Yeah, we talked about that at the beginning of the video or the stream, but yeah, basically, I don't think. I mean, depending on the lawsuit, there's a possibility they might have to go in and re-edit Tarkin, but I doubt it. I really doubt that would be what happens. But we kind of talked about it in relationship to Andor season 2, and could Tarkin appear there? But yeah, check that out at the beginning here because we are over time. So we're going to try to wrap up these last few questions. But thanks for joining us again, Battis. I appreciate hearing from you again. Also says, have you guys bought the 4K steelbooks of the Star Wars shows? How is the image on Kenobi compared with Disney Plus? I have the Mandalorian ones, and I think just in general, image is always better on disc. It will always be better just purely because a stream, you have to have perfect connection to get the most flawless stream. It's also just, hard copies just always transfer better. It's always better visually, and it's always better audibly. I have not picked up Kenobi, and I have not picked up Andor yet, but I'm looking forward to picking those up. And then Matthew says, I don't have the 4K, but the Blu-ray of Obi-Wan was impressive. Despite the show looking overall fan filmy, the cinematography was not an aspect they skimped on. Huh, so they do you think they upscale it, or do you think it just generally looks better? Because I think it would be hard for the transfer to make the set design look better. The set design and the way overall it's staged, it wouldn't look any better. So is it just you think they improved lighting, or they improved what do you think they enhanced on the Blu-ray? Now it makes me want to get it to check it
Yeah,
out.
I wonder if it is like the grain is removed from a lot of like the darker nighttime scenes where it's so obvious, right? Like I wonder if that final duel looks a lot better on disc, right? Because it's not the most interesting place. Like I wish there was some more like neon blue lighting or some opposite imagery to Mustafar, right? With like some supercharged or super freezing cold water or something, right? Just to thematically be a little different, but it doesn't look horrible. It just was very hidden.
Yeah. And well, I don't know. Now I want to check it out. I am planning on getting them eventually. It's just always hard to pull a trigger on like $45 4K Blu-rays when you've already seen them multiple times. But yeah, I definitely want them for the collection because I love the art and this what they've done with those steel books. It just looks really, really nice. The Obi-Wan art especially looks great on the cover. So definitely gonna pick those up one day. Badasai says, is there a realistic possibility that the Acolyte can come back for season 2 and 3 in the future before the cast gets too old? Books and comics are not enough to make justice to that story. I don't think there's a realistic shot anytime soon. I mean that the cast is pretty young, so you have a lot of years to work with before their age becomes a problem. So I don't think you have to worry about that. I think the Acolyte at this point represents a very controversial period for the Star Wars franchise and kind of an end of an era to where an end of an era that they're trying to move on from. And we kind of talked about this last week with the Ahsoka season 2 announcement. And this was another little story that kind of broke right after that. And we didn't include it in this video because it's kind of a week old at this point. But there was a little story that broke about how Lucasfilm basically wants to now focus on one show a year instead of more than one, which we talked about that last week with like Andor. Season 2 is the only thing we have announced for next year besides the end of Skeleton Crew carrying into 2025. So what is coming from Lucasfilm? And it's very much so, we said it last week, a strong possibility that it's just Andor because they're kind of retooling their whole strategy at this point. And so I think if the Acolyte ever comes back, it's not going to be the Acolyte season 2 or 3. It will be completely repackaged as a new show. Kind of like if you checked out my video that I posted about what's the future of Darth Plagueis now that we don't have the Acolyte. Do we get more books? Do we get more show? I think they would probably repackage something around Darth Plagueis and have some of the elements of Osha and the Stranger stories fleshed out and finished in a Darth Plagueis show where he's the focus and their stories are the backdrop. I think you'll see these characters come back. And you can never say never for a season 2 or 3 of the Acolyte, but I just do think that it's not going to be anytime soon. If they announce it, at best it'll be announced, I think, in 2, 3, 4 years. when it comes out will be even longer than that. So you're looking at a long time between now and
Yeah.
a possible Acolyte season 2.
No, I fully agree. I mean, obviously, I'm a lot, not a lot, but I'm definitely more positive on the show than Liam is. But it for 180 million, it really is the worst of the Chapek era. Just big inflated budgets, kind of emphasizing like quantity over quality. And the shame is that like the Acolyte conceptually, the way it was pitched was like following dark side acolytes as the first true like Sith story. That I think could have done really well. It seemingly changed or became a little bit more focused on having a Jedi perspective, maybe because they want to. It's a little bit more makes sense to have more Jedi around, more lightsabers. Maybe that's what they thought. Again, cinematography for it is incredible, but for 180 million for the longest episodes being two flashback episodes where they're still very very adamant about withholding details, it's not great. Like there should have been more to understand the turn that Osha does quite well in the back half of the show, but that first half, like where she's actually with the Jedi, is very skimpish. May's turn, like I understand, like okay, your sister's here, that's gonna take the priority, but she's very volatile without any like story reason. She's a character that is now kind of left as not just not dead, but kind of reset to have her own journey and stakes again, but definitely going to be like weaponized and used by Vernestra, which is another huge issue for a lot of people who love her character in the High Republic, who thought this was like a great way to get a lot of High Republic connections. But the Acolyte is, for the most part, like on the surface level connected to the High Republic. It's got like, some connections, but it's not directly influenced by how great those books are. So it had a lot of different things that felt like the story group was like, yeah, you can put in a character here that would work in for your character. And Vernestra's the choice because she could plausibly live this long and all that. And now you're in this really difficult situation, just like Luke is for a lot of us, with that huge gap in the character timeline where you don't understand the choices you made. Why is she like this? Especially with Vernestra, who in Phase 3 is very distrustful of the Jedi Council, especially Elzar Mann and everything else, right? And very reluctant. She's more on the run, like doing things on the field. Yeah, I don't understand necessarily, and the show doesn't do anything to explain why she's so committed to like playing this political game in the Senate. Even if that is where her character eventually goes, it's 100 years, and that's hard to like make up in storytelling. That's why I agree to a certain degree, bet aside that we need more visual storytelling, like an animated show or prequel or something. But then that brings up the whole like box that the finale of the show implies of Plagueis around. Like, does it make sense to call this second season even the Acolyte season 2? Yes, if it's only focused on Osha and Chimere training, but even Leslie's like, well, Plagueis is gonna come and ruin their story of like this twisted romance, this connection that they have with each other. And ironically, still the best named show of the Star Wars shows outside of animation is the one that's canceled. You still have Ahsoka that really is just another chapter of The Mandalorian. You have the Book of Boba Fett, which is not really about Boba Fett by the end, right? Like this next era has to also be very smart about if we're going to do these shows that have multiple characters, multiple storylines existing or not. How do we name them and how do they like build up into the hype of these shows that are going to be released? Acolyte probably got a lot of hype for the name, for its visual of its first logo and all that. Ahsoka got hype because it was Ahsoka, but it's not entirely about Ahsoka. It's a lot more about Balin. It's a lot more about Thrawn and his return. So it's kind of ironic that Acolyte still, even with its changes from its initial description, was still the best named. But yeah, I think now with the second Iger era, we have to be smarter about how we name these live action shows if we're going to have multiple storylines that don't really fit together on paper.
No, for sure. And it's going to be interesting. We also talked about this last week, just what their direction is for the future. If they do switch to one show a year live action, does that mean they supplement the dead time between Star Wars shows with more animation? Does that mean they supplement it with multiple theatrical releases a year? We're not going to just only have one Star Wars thing a year. Not at this point. That's not going to start happening. Maybe next year, because it seems like next year is going to be that kind of transition year for Star Wars. But once 2026 rolls around, I think they're really doing a lot of soul searching and looking interiorly at their properties and what they have going at Lucasfilm, what works, what doesn't work, why this worked, why it didn't work, what can they make better. And I think they're trying their best to figure out, how do we make Star Wars theatrical again? How do we make Star Wars exciting again, where it's not just expected, it's something that people really look forward to. Star Wars has always been event films and event shows, and it's kind of lost that event nature in the last few years. How do we recapture that magic? And I think their first step is the Mandalorian and Grogu. It's a new direction, it's a new opportunity for them to get these characters on the big screen, and we'll see what follows, because we mentioned last week, I think they've always wanted Ahsoka season 2 to be the Ahsoka movie that Dave Filoni was going to make, and that didn't work out because the viewership wasn't as high and the quality wasn't as high as they had hoped. So now what do? They retool it, get a second season. Things are changing a lot over there, but I think now they're not just flying by the seat of their pants. They're starting to break it down and say, okay, this is our strategy. And I think that's always
Smart.
the right move. That's always the correct way to go. If you're not doing well, don't just keep throwing stuff out there. You should be able to, in any industry, in any job, in anything in the world, you try your best and you put things out there, you take risks, you go for it. And if it doesn't work, you adapt and you change and you figure it out, and you don't just say, hey, well, some people like this, so we adapt to mediocrity. No, you keep looking for ways to get better. And I think that's what they're doing right now. I think they really are. And we can wrap it up here on About a Size next question, because we're not going to have time to get to everybody's. But thank you so much for everybody who's joined. And Badger Size says, and this kind of, I think, goes with what we were just talking about. Do you think Star Wars needs a definitive ending like in episode 10, 11, or 12, like Return of the King is for the Tolkien universe and Return of the Jedi originally was for the Star Wars saga? I think it should have a definitive happy ending. I don't think it does. And I think for two reasons. I would have agreed with you because I think Return of the Jedi is an excellent ending, and I would have been happy with that as our ending. I'm not throwing shade at the sequels. Like, this was just our reality, right? For so long, it was the ending of Star Wars for over 30 years. Um, and so that was, I think, what we were all comfortable and used to. Now, The Rise of Skywalker is our ending of Star Wars. And I think it's even kind of less definitive than the ending of Return of the Jedi, with its optimism. But I think the main reason you can't Return of the King Star Wars anymore is because the heart and soul of Star Wars was the original trilogy characters. And now that they're all dead in universe in the sequels, you can't really have that Frodo sailing off to the Undying Lands, because there's no Luke, Leia, or Han left to do that with, And I'm not trying to, say that Rey or Finn or Poe are bad characters, but they're just not the core of Star Wars. They've been in 3 movies versus, and their movies are coming up on 10 years now, versus characters that have been around for almost 50 years. So it is just the core of what makes this franchise. And with the Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the Tolkien world that was built around the success of Lord of the Rings as a book series, um, it starts with a core group of characters that people fall in love with. And I think now with Star Wars, we've moved on from those characters. We've moved on in directions that has satisfied some people and very much so not satisfied others. And now we just kind of have to work our way forward with these new characters. And I think if you ever do a perfect bow ending to Star Wars, you would have to kind of reclaim and recreate characters that lasted for a significant amount of time and people fell in love with. And that's a tall task. And since they're not the original characters from the original movies, it's going to be very hard for that to ever really happen for this franchise.
Yeah, and if there's one thing that I think the sequels can really flesh out and is actually a thematically strong point, is that the Skywalkers are done, right? Like, I know we want Ben Solo to come back, and I think there's an interesting story, but he wouldn't really come back as a Skywalker. Like, yes, by blood, sure, but if he comes back, it's through some mystery of the Force dyad and that connection with Rey, who is a Palpatine by synthetic, cloning, Strand cast, and all that. So yeah, that's the only way the Skywalkers continue, but I wouldn't even call him like a full return. It'd be more like phasing in and out between like the netherworld of the Force and swapping places maybe with Ray or something like something more fantastical, which I'll always give credit for the sequels when they do stuff with the Force. It has been very like unique and different instead of like relatively grounded like the prequels and original trilogy are. But I think the one idea of like, that Skywalkers are done, I I think that you can really develop and flesh that out, and that's that conclusion that their story is done. That's an issue that arguably plagues the EU. It's fine really until the last book of New Jedi Order, the Unifying Force, but then you still got Luke dragging on and still like being that figure for decades and decades when his nephews and his children should be the ones in charge. And then even in Legacy, which is basically a remix of original trilogy, prequel, and random other bits of Star Wars, right? And in a new age, you have your villain who is a one Sith who was first introduced during the Clone Wars as a Jedi, and then your hero is like sixth or seventh gen Skywalker. Like, I get the idea of like saying, okay, like Skywalker should continue. I don't disagree or agree in any sense, right? Whatever happens, happens. But I think you have to have a definitive ending to the Skywalkers as a group because, man, every other generation it goes wrong for them, and every other generation has to fix it. And you don't think the galaxy would be tired after like the third war, right? Like if there's like seven or eight that they like deal with in EU, and it's just like okay, like it gets a little implausible to me. So I don't mind the idea that their story is done. But the whole point is that it's Star Wars, multiple wars in the stars. You don't need just them. You can have interesting stories like fracture different governments, like post Rise of Skywalker. Who are like, hey, we're not doing anything past maybe a loose federation, and then you can see how powers like the Mandalorians and the Jedi and how they play as like kind of these loose cannons in this galaxy, right? Like how people who are still like trying to do the good empire that the First Order kind of ripped away from their memory because of just how extremist they were versus the people who are separatists. Like there's so many different ways to make conflicts happen in Star Wars. It's definitely fun to have the Force involved. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't have to be the Skywalkers. And technically speaking, Return of the King was not meant to be the ending of the Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wrote parts of the New Shadow, which became like a sort of epilogue that he canceled, but he was like kind of thinking what would come next, right? And it would be like the remnants, the remains of the evil left behind after Sauron's defeat and all that. So we already kind of dealt with that in that same manner with the sequel trilogy, kind of redoing it or like bringing the most extreme polar examples of it. Now I think it's done, right? It's not great how it concludes, but again, flesh it out. Animated shows like Clone Wars, new content leading up to this new Jedi Order film. Like Liam said, let's have a real game plan leading into that film or like concurrently with that film. And then, it will feel better. Maybe that film starts feeling like an episode 10 for us and is a lot better of a conclusion.
Yeah, and I think you're never gonna have be done with content, but I
Yeah.
get what you mean, Batsasai, with like having that definitive send off, and I think 9 is where we missed that opportunity. It was always going to be a missed opportunity because we didn't have Carrie Fisher, so it wouldn't. I think it would have always felt hollow, even if Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill were still like Luke and Han were still alive in those movies. But I think ultimately the way they approached the sequel trilogy, the way they decided to conclude each one of those three characters' arcs, I think that's ultimately kind of killed the ability to have a sentimental wrap up to like the core of what Star Wars was. There's always going to be future stories, but I understand what you mean by that Return of the King style, like a true goodbye to everybody. And yeah, we won't get that anymore, just by the nature of the way 7, 8, and 9 were created. But that's going to wrap up our stream for the week. We went a little longer, but thanks everybody for joining us for this entire thing. We appreciate you joining. Stay tuned again next week for another Ask Us Anything and live stream as Star Wars news becomes a little bit more scarce every single week, the more we rely on your questions. So keep coming to these streams, keep bringing your questions, your comments, your theories, your thoughts on anything you'd like to discuss. We're going to give you our opinions. You can agree with us, you can disagree with us. Let's have a chat in the comments and in the chat room, and then talk about all things Star Wars and all things related to pop culture and film and anything you would like to discuss. So keep coming back. We appreciate your guys' support. Make sure you like the video if you haven't yet. Subscribe to the channel if you're new, and join us every single week. Stay tuned for more videos and more shorts and more polls every single week. We've got a lot of content on the channel. If you would like to check out other ways to support the channel, you can check out our Patreon and YouTube memberships, where we have a lot of cool perks as well, where you can interact with us in more varied detail on there. Thank you so much for watching this week's stream, and we will see you guys all next week. Good night, everybody.